Brian Flores lawsuit and the ramifications continue to reverberate throughout the NFL. It's been a strange 18 hours or so. Initially, the people who were targeted by the Brian Flores allegations decided that their best course of action was to say nothing. Late last night, Stephen Ross couldn't stay silent anymore. I think he started to realize this is pretty serious. I can't just keep my mouth shut about this kind of an accusation. If it's not true, I need to be shouting it from the rooftops. So we got a very strongly worded statement from Stephen Ross last night calling the allegation that he offered $100,000 per loss to Brian Flores back in 2019 malicious and defamatory, and the kind of words that make you think maybe he's thinking about pursuing legal action. Enter John Elway. He issued a statement today on his own. He's no longer technically, I don't want to say an employee, but he doesn't have a title. He's an advisor now with the Denver Broncos. He is in the process of easing out of the organization. He's helping GM George Paton, but he was the GM back in 2019 when they hired Vic Fangio. And there's Elway's statement. While I was not planning to respond publicly to the false and defamatory claims by Brian Flores, I cannot be silent any longer. With my character, integrity, and professionalism being attacked, I took Coach Flores very seriously as a candidate for a head coaching position in 2019 and enjoyed our 3.5-hour interview with him. Along with the rest of our group, I was prepared, ready, and fully engaged during the entire interview for Brian to make an assumption about my appearance and state of mind that morning was subjective, hurtful, and just plain wrong. I interviewed Brian in good faith, giving him the same consideration and opportunity as every other candidate for a head coaching position in 2019. Elway separately said in that statement that they had flown in overnight after interviewing a candidate in Denver because, see, at the time, Flores working for the Patriots in the playoff chase that resulted in the Super Bowl 53 championship, they had to go to him. So if he was disheveled, and that was Flores' conclusion, that they were hungover, that the Broncos contingent was hungover. And Elway said if we looked disheveled, it was because we were on a plane all night and didn't sleep, basically. So the battle has been joined. Now, when he says false and defamatory, Myles, makes me think he's thinking about pursuing his options as well against Brian Flores. But it's changed since we did this last night. Two of the guys implicated by Flores having some strong things to say in opposition to his contentions.
Yeah, and, I don't necessarily think that that's entirely unexpected, right? I think that certainly once somebody has an accusation against you, you do have the right to defend yourself to that accusation. And at this point, it's kind of a he said sort of deal. When you're thinking about, what these statements are and the lawsuit and the complaint versus what Stephen Ross had to say and what John Elway had to say. But then you also have reports like that one from the NFL media's Cameron Wolfe, where he said that there is someone who can corroborate what Brian Flores had to say about the $100,000 payments for losses. So, that's one thing that's there. And obviously there were other people in that Broncos contingent, that would have interviewed Brian Flores. And so that's where it's like, what are we ever going to know about what the truth is, especially in that particular situation with the Broncos? It's like two people can have very, very different perceptions of the same exact thing where something is going on. I mean, look, Brian Flores can really perceive that he's not being taken seriously in an interview, even though John Elway can think he's presenting himself as somebody who is taking this seriously. But I mean, I think we've all maybe been in situations where you're in an interview, you're in a meeting, and a superior of yours just doesn't seem to be paying any attention to what you're saying. And from that perspective, I'm like, I understand why Brian Flores would be extremely annoyed by that. So I guess I say all that to say I'm not entirely surprised that Elway and that Ross have come out as strongly as they have against what Brian Flores leveraged against them.
I will say this, though. If you're Brian Flores and you are going to make strong allegations like that in support of your claims, he didn't have to join the Broncos. He didn't have to go back to 2019 and accuse them of conducting a sham interview and not having any real interest in hiring him to be their head coach. He didn't have to make those allegations. I am a firm believer that you need to make your strong allegations with precision. It can't be close. It can't be a matter of interpretation. You got to be able to prove it. And I said yesterday, when a guy is willing to risk his career when he comes to the table with claims like this, that gives it an instant boost of credibility for me. But the problem is, Myles, if you overreach with one, it makes it harder to make the others stick. Because if one can be proven to be not credible, then credibility questions arise about the ones that may be 100% accurate. So don't dilute your strongest points. Don't dilute the things you can prove with a corroborating witness, like the $100,000 offer. Don't do that and then have some other claim that, because what's going to happen is they're going to parade in one after another of the Broncos people who were there, and they're all going to say the same thing John Elway said. And you reach a critical mass, and I've been there, and I've done that, and I've learned it the hard way. You reach a critical mass of witnesses who will tell the same story where you just get a visceral sense they can't all be lying. They can't all be lying. It's just like the Deshaun Watson thing, like somewhere between
exactly
3 and 22, somewhere you hit a number where you say they can't all be lying.
Right. And that's why I don't really love playing like what's both sides of this. And like that's kind of what I feel like I did with the first thing I said. But I agree with you that when you have somebody who is literally risking his career in order to make these claims, then that definitely boosts the credibility of it in my mind. Because it's like, why would he lie? Why would he just bring this up out of nowhere when you have something that's a little bit more concrete, if you want to call it that, from what he experienced with the Giants a few weeks ago, and also what he, we assume, experienced with Stephen Ross in being his employee over the course of 3 years, right? So this is going back to something where you're saying, all right, well, if this really happened, then why, or if this did not happen, then why would Brian Flores bring it up in this context where we already have heard now that there is somebody who can corroborate what happened with Stephen Ross, right? But it's also true that if this one is not proved to be deemed to be credible, then yeah, that's going to hurt everything else that he's saying. And I don't know. I mean, I guess as somebody who would like to see change in the hiring practices, I don't really want that to be the case.
Right. But Myles, here's the thing. There's two different realities. And what you said earlier was 100% accurate. This is the way human beings process information. And you can have multiple different interpretations of the same event that plays out in front of people. They see it with their naked eyes, unblinking Clockwork Orange style, and they still have a different interpretation between the time the information goes through their eyes, to their brains, stays in their brains, mixes in with all sorts of other crap, and then later comes out their mouths. It can be completely different. My point is this. The world changes when you go to court. The world changes when you're trying to convince a jury, a judge, whoever, that you're right, because it's impossible to engineer the benefit of the doubt, because everything you do, everything you say, they are throwing mud back at you any way they can, every way they can. If you watched any of the hearing today, not a hearing, a hybrid roundtable, whatever that means, regarding the Washington football team investigation, you would see the questions, how different they were based upon whether or not the person asking was Democrat or Republican. But you see how the mud gets thrown when it's time to discredit people. And it's so reckless. And at times it seems so weird. But you have to stand up in that storm and tell your story. So you better be damn sure you can tell a story that holds up under questioning. Goodfellas, Henry, I'm concerned you may not hold up under questioning. You got to be able to hold up under questioning. So you got to pick a horse that you know will ride. That's my point. And
right.
If you're not 100% sure you can sell this notion that a bunch of drunken stumblebums walked into the room, unless you got pictures on your phone or something like that, you're running the risk that you are going to step on a rake when the time comes to prove it. That's all I'm saying.
I would like to think that Flores' lawyers would have told him that. right? What you just said,
I'd like to think it too, but it doesn't always happen that way.
Well, I guess not everybody was as good a lawyer as you used to be. Maybe you should have stayed in it.
Trust No, it's easy for me to say it now because I have the scars on my ass, okay? That's why they call it practice of law. Yeah. You need to practice in order to get better. And most of the things I learned were from my F-ups, not from the days that things went well. Trust me. I learned a lot of things the hard way. So,
I believe that.
That's my effort of humility. But it's also 100% accurate. And that's my point. Whatever you're going to accuse someone of, you better be able to back it up because they're going to do everything they can to make it look like you're not telling the truth. And if they can undermine your credibility in one area, it necessarily undermines your credibility in the other.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.